Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white against the black leather. The highway stretched endlessly before her, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the South Dakota plains. She had been driving for 6 hours straight, running from a life that had shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. 3 days ago, she had buried her daughter. The words still felt unreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Emma had been only 7 years old, bright and full of laughter, with golden curls that bounced when she ran. A drunk driver had stolen all of that in an instant, turning Sarah's world into a hollow shell of grief and rage. Her husband Mark hadn't been able to handle it. While Sarah drowned in sorrow, he had retreated into silence and bottles of whiskey. Last week, she had found divorce papers on the kitchen table, his wedding ring placed carefully on top. He was gone by the time she got home from the cemetery, leaving only a note that said he couldn't look at her anymore without seeing Emma. Sarah had lost everything. Her daughter. Her marriage. Her sanity, perhaps. The Boston apartment they had called home felt like a tomb, every corner holding memories that cut like broken glass. She needed to disappear, to go somewhere nobody knew her name or her tragedy. The GPS showed she was nearing the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. She hadn't planned to come here specifically. She had simply driven west, following the sun, stopping only for gas and coffee that tasted like ashes in her mouth. But as the landscape opened up around her, something about the vast emptiness spoke to the void inside her chest. The sky was beginning to bruise with twilight when her car started making a concerning noise. A grinding sound, followed by a series of alarming clanks. Sarah's heart sank as smoke began seeping from under the hood. She managed to pull off onto a dirt road before the engine gave a final, decisive death rattle. Silence engulfed her. Complete and absolute. No city sounds, no traffic, no voices. Just wind whispering through tall grass and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Sarah got out of the car and looked around. Miles of rolling hills stretched in every direction, painted in shades of amber and gold by the setting sun. She had no cell phone signal. She was alone. For the first time since Emma's death, Sarah felt something other than numbness. She felt fear. But there was also something else, something she couldn't quite name. A strange sense that she was exactly where she needed to be. She started walking. The dirt road wound through the prairie, and she followed it without thinking, putting one foot in front of the other. The physical act of moving felt good, honest, real. Her designer shoes weren't made for hiking, but she didn't care. Blisters formed and burst, but the pain was almost welcome. It was something to feel besides the crushing weight of loss. As darkness fell, Sarah saw lights in the distance. A small cluster of buildings materialized from the twilight, simple structures that seemed to grow naturally from the land itself. As she drew closer, she could see it was some kind of community center. People moved about, their voices carrying on the evening breeze. She hesitated at the edge of the property, suddenly aware of how out of place she must look in her wrinkled business clothes and ruined heels. A dog barked, and several heads turned in her direction. Sarah stood frozen, exhausted and lost, as a group of people began walking toward her. They moved with curiosity but without hostility, and as they came closer, Sarah could see weathered faces marked by sun and wind and life. An older woman reached her first, her eyes kind and knowing. She took in Sarah's disheveled appearance, the tear tracks on her face, the haunted look in her eyes. Without a word, she reached out and took Sarah's hand. That simple touch broke something inside Sarah. The wall she had built around her grief cracked, and suddenly she was sobbing, her knees buckling. The woman caught her, strong arms holding her upright, and Sarah heard her speaking in a language she didn't understand, words that sounded like water over stones, ancient and soothing. She had reached the absolute bottom of her despair. What she didn't know was that from this darkest moment, everything was about to change. Sarah woke to the smell of sage and cedar smoke. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. The room was small and simple, walls decorated with colorful quilts and photographs of smiling families. Sunlight streamed through a window, warm and golden, so different from the harsh gray light of Boston winters. Memory returned slowly. The breakdown. The kind woman who had guided her to this room, who had wrapped her in blankets and brought her hot soup that Sarah had barely touched. She had cried until she had nothing left, then fallen into a sleep so deep it felt like drowning. Someone knocked softly on the door. The same older woman from last night entered, carrying a tray with tea and fry bread. Her face was lined with age and wisdom, her long gray hair braided down her back. She introduced herself as Rose Charging Eagle, and her English was accented but clear. "You were sent here for a reason," Rose said, settling into a chair beside the bed. It wasn't a question. She spoke with the certainty of someone who understood things beyond the visible world. The spirits don't bring people to our doorstep by accident. Sarah wanted to argue, to say it was just car trouble and bad luck, but the words died in her throat. She had stopped believing in randomness the day Emma died. If the universe could be that cruel, maybe it could also be kind. Maybe there was meaning in this strange deed too. Rose didn't press her to talk. Instead, she told Sarah about the community, about the healing circles they held every week, about the old ways that had sustained their people through centuries of heartbreak and survival. She spoke of ceremonies and traditions, of finding strength in connection to the earth and to each other. "Tonight, we have a gathering," Rose said. "You should come. You don't have to speak. Just listen. Sometimes that's enough." Sarah spent the day in a fog, helping Rose with simple tasks around the community center. She chopped vegetables for the evening meal, folded chairs, swept floors. The mundane activities anchored her, gave her something to focus on besides the screaming void where her heart used to be. People came and went, greeting her with nods and small smiles. Nobody asked questions. Nobody demanded explanations. Their quiet acceptance was a balm she hadn't known she needed. As evening approached, people began gathering in a large circular room. Sarah hung back, uncertain, but Rose gently guided her to a seat in the circle. About 30 people were present, ranging from young children to elders with faces like living history books. In the center of the circle, a small fire burned in a metal bowl, sending fragrant smoke toward the ceiling. That's when she first saw him. He entered the room with a presence that made everyone sit a little straighter. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with the controlled grace of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. His hair was long and black, pulled back from a face that could have been carved from stone. High cheekbones, strong jaw, eyes so dark they seemed to hold depths Sarah couldn't begin to fathom. He wore jeans and a simple shirt, but there was something about him that suggested power held carefully in check. Rose leaned over and whispered, "That's Joseph Broken Arrow. He leads our ceremonies. He's a good man, though he carries his own sorrows." Joseph's eyes swept the circle, pausing when they reached Sarah. The connection was instant and electric, like touching a live wire. He held her gaze for a long moment, and Sarah felt seen in a way she hadn't experienced in months. Not pitied. Not judged. Simply seen, all the way down to her broken core. He nodded to her, a small acknowledgement, then began to speak. His voice was deep and resonant, filling the space with words in Lakota. Rose translated quietly for Sarah, explaining that he was offering prayers, acknowledging the spirits of the ancestors, creating sacred space for healing. As the ceremony progressed, people began to share their stories. A young man spoke of addiction and recovery. A grandmother talked about losing her son to violence. A teenage girl shared her struggles with depression. Each story was met with murmurs of understanding, with tears and nods and hands reaching out to touch shoulders in comfort. Sarah felt her own story rising in her throat like bile. She didn't plan to speak. She had come only to observe, to hide in the anonymity of the circle. But when Joseph's eyes found hers again, something in his expression told her it was safe. That this was a place where pain could be spoken without shame. She opened her mouth, and Emma's name fell out. Then the rest came tumbling after. The accident. The funeral. Mark's abandonment. The unbearable weight of waking up every morning to a world that no longer contained her child. She spoke of the guilt, the rage, the moments when she had wanted to stop existing just to make the pain end. The circle listened. Nobody interrupted. Nobody offered empty platitudes. When Sarah finally fell silent, shaking and raw, Rose squeezed her hand. Across the circle, Joseph watched her with eyes that held understanding too deep for words. "Loss is a path we all walk," he said in English, his voice rough with emotion. "Some paths are darker than others. But you don't have to walk alone." Sarah stayed. She told herself it was just until her car was fixed, but days turned into a week, then two. A local mechanic named Tommy Little Bear was working on her vehicle, but parts had to be ordered, and the repairs were taking time. Sarah found she didn't mind the delay. For the first time since Emma's death, she wasn't suffocating under the weight of her grief. Rose had given her a small cabin to stay in, a simple structure with a wood stove and a porch that overlooked the endless prairie. Sarah spent her mornings helping at the community center, cooking meals and organizing supplies. The work was humble and grounding, so different from her former life as a marketing executive in Boston. That version of herself felt like a stranger now, someone who had existed in a dream she had violently awakened from. Joseph Broken Arrow was everywhere and nowhere. She would see him leading a group of young men in traditional songs, his voice rising strong and clear. She would catch glimpses of him riding across the hills on horseback, moving like he was part of the animal itself. Sometimes she would find him sitting alone at dawn, facing east, so still he seemed to be part of the landscape. They rarely spoke directly, but Sarah felt his presence like a constant current running beneath the surface of her days. When their eyes met across the community center, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition. Understanding. A pull neither of them was ready to acknowledge. Rose noticed, of course. One evening, as they prepared food together, the older woman smiled knowingly. "Joseph has been alone for 5 years," she said. "Since his wife and son died in a car accident." Sarah's hands stilled over the vegetables she was chopping. The words hit her like a physical blow. She looked at Rose, seeing confirmation in those wise eyes. Joseph understood her grief because he lived in the same country of loss. He was driving, Rose continued quietly. A truck ran a red light. His wife died instantly. His son lived for 3 days in the hospital. Joseph hasn't forgiven himself, even though there was nothing he could have done differently. Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes. She thought of Joseph's contained strength, the way he held himself with such careful control. She understood now. He was holding himself together through sheer force of will, just as she was. They were both walking wounded, pretending to be whole. That night, another ceremony was held. This one was different, more intimate. Only a dozen people gathered in a small round building Rose called a sweat lodge. Steam rose from hot rocks in the center, and the air was thick with moisture and sage smoke. Sarah had been nervous about participating, but Rose assured her it was safe, that the ceremony was for purification and prayer. Joseph led them through rounds of songs and prayers, pouring water on the hot stones until steam filled the space and Sarah could barely breathe. In the darkness and heat, boundaries dissolved. She lost track of where her body ended and the world began. Tears mixed with sweat, and she cried for Emma, for herself, for everyone who had ever lost someone they loved more than life itself. When they emerged into the cool night air, Sarah felt lighter. Scraped clean. Joseph was standing by the fire, his skin glistening with moisture, his chest rising and falling with deep breaths. Their eyes met, and this time neither looked away. He walked toward her slowly, deliberately. Up close, she could see the silver strands threading through his dark hair, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the sadness that lived permanently in his eyes. He was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with survival. "You carry your daughter with you," Joseph said. His voice was soft, meant only for her. "I can see her in your eyes. That's not wrong. That's love." Sarah's breath caught. Nobody had said anything like that to her. Everyone back home had wanted her to move on, to heal, to stop being so sad. But Joseph understood that Emma would always be part of her, that grief was just another name for love with nowhere to go. "I see your son in you too," she whispered. "And your wife." His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he would walk away. Instead, he reached out and took her hand. His palm was calloused and warm, solid and real. They stood like that under the stars, two broken people holding onto each other in the darkness. Over the following days, they began spending more time together. Joseph taught her about Lakota traditions, about the sacred connection between all living things. They would ride horses across the prairie, the wind wild in their hair, and he would point out medicinal plants and tell her their names in his language. He showed her how to pray with tobacco ties, how to offer gratitude to the 4 directions, how to find moments of peace in the midst of sorrow. Sarah felt herself changing. The rigid, controlled person she had been was cracking open, making room for something wilder and more true. She learned to sit in silence without fear, to let grief move through her like weather instead of trying to build walls against it. In Joseph's presence, she didn't have to pretend to be okay. She could just be. The storm came in late September, rolling across the plains with biblical fury. Sarah had never seen anything like it. The sky turned green, then black, and the wind howled like something alive and angry. Rain lashed the windows of her cabin with violence that made her afraid the glass would shatter. She was huddled by the wood stove, trying not to panic, when someone pounded on her door. She opened it to find Joseph, soaked through and breathing hard. He had ridden through the storm to check on her, worried she might be frightened. The concern in his eyes made her heart stutter. "I'm okay," she said, but her voice shook. The truth was, the storm had awakened something primal in her. The raw power of nature felt like a mirror to the chaos inside her soul. She was trembling, and it had nothing to do with the cold. Joseph stepped inside, water dripping from his hair and clothes. He closed the door against the screaming wind, and suddenly the small cabin felt even smaller. The air between them was charged with more than electricity from the storm. For weeks, they had been circling each other, growing closer but maintaining careful distance. Now, alone in the candlelit cabin with the world raging outside, those boundaries felt impossibly thin. "I should go," Joseph said, but he didn't move. He stood there, water pooling at his feet, his dark eyes locked on hers. Sarah saw the battle playing out behind his expression. Want warring with guilt. Desire fighting against the loyalty he still felt to his dead wife. Sarah understood. She felt the same conflict. Loving someone new felt like a betrayal of Emma, of the mother she had been, of the family she had lost. But she was also so tired of being alone, of carrying her grief like stones in her pockets, dragging her down toward drowning. "Stay," she whispered. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. "Stay through the storm. Stay here with me. Stay in my life." Joseph closed the distance between them in 3 strides. His hands cupped her face, thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. His touch was gentle but certain, and when he lowered his mouth to hers, Sarah felt something inside her chest crack open. The kiss was slow and deep, tasting of rain and desperation and hope she had thought was dead forever. They broke apart, both breathing hard. Joseph rested his forehead against hers, his hands trembling slightly where they held her. "I'm afraid," he admitted. His vulnerability was stunning, coming from someone who seemed so unshakable. "I'm afraid if I let myself love you, I'll lose you too. I can't survive that again." "I'm afraid of the same thing," Sarah said. She took his hands in hers, holding tight. "But I'm more afraid of living the rest of my life afraid. Of letting fear make all my choices. Emma would hate that. She would want me to be brave." Speaking her daughter's name out loud in this context felt both wrong and right. Emma had loved so fiercely, so completely. She had thrown herself into life with abandon, finding joy in everything from puddle jumping to butterfly catching. Sarah realized that living in perpetual grief was not honoring Emma's memory. Living fully, loving bravely, finding happiness even after devastating loss, that was the real tribute. Joseph pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her like he could shield her from every hurt the world might inflict. They held each other as the storm raged, 2 people who had been shattered finding strength in their shared brokenness. The wind howled and rain pounded the roof, but inside the cabin, something quiet and precious was taking root. They talked through the night. Joseph told her about his wife Maya, about her laugh and her terrible cooking and the way she sang off-key in the shower. He spoke about his son Thomas, who had been 4 years old and obsessed with dinosaurs. He shared the crushing guilt he still carried, the way he replayed that day over and over, searching for what he could have done differently. Sarah talked about Emma, really talked about her, for the first time since the funeral. She described her daughter's stubborn independence, her imaginary friend named Mr. Whiskers, the way she had insisted on wearing her princess costume to the grocery store every single week. She spoke about the last morning, how Emma had hugged her extra tight before school, almost like she knew. The memory was agony, but sharing it with Joseph somehow made it bearable. As dawn broke, the storm passed. They walked outside together to find the world washed clean, the air so clear it hurt to breathe. The prairie stretched out endlessly, golden in the early light, and Sarah felt something shift inside her. She wasn't healed. Healing from this kind of loss might never be complete. But she was no longer drowning. She had found someone who understood that you could hold grief and joy simultaneously, that loving again didn't mean forgetting who you'd loved before. Joseph took her hand, lacing their fingers together. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a promise. They stood there watching the sunrise, 2 survivors choosing life over despair, choosing each other over loneliness, choosing to believe that their broken pieces might fit together into something whole. 3 months later, Sarah stood in front of the mirror in Rose's house, adjusting the traditional Lakota dress that had been carefully crafted for this day. The doeskin was soft against her skin, decorated with intricate beadwork in blues and whites that Rose said represented healing and new beginnings. Her blonde hair had been braided with eagle feathers, a gift from Joseph's family, acceptance of her place among them. Today, she and Joseph would be married in a traditional ceremony, blending Lakota customs with their own personal vows. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she touched the dress, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. 6 months ago, she had been running from her life, certain she would never feel anything but pain again. Now she was choosing to build something new, something that honored both her past and her future. Rose entered the room, her eyes shining with tears. She had become like a mother to Sarah, teaching her not just about Lakota culture but about resilience and grace. "You look beautiful," she said. Are you ready? Sarah thought about the question. Was she ready to marry a man she had known for such a short time? Was she ready to make a home on this reservation, so far from everything she had known? Was she ready to open her heart again, knowing it could be broken just as thoroughly as before? The answer was yes. Not because she had stopped grieving Emma, she would carry that love and loss forever. Not because she was completely healed, healing was a journey, not a destination. But because she had learned something essential from the Lakota people who had welcomed her. Life was a circle, not a straight line. Endings and beginnings existed together. You could honor what was lost while embracing what was found. The ceremony took place on a hill overlooking the vast prairie, with the entire community gathered in witness. Joseph stood waiting, dressed in traditional regalia, his hair loose and flowing in the wind. When he saw Sarah approaching, his expression transformed into something so tender it made her breath catch. This strong, stoic man who had survived such devastating loss looked at her like she was a miracle he had stopped believing in. An elder named Henry Stands Tall conducted the ceremony in Lakota, with Rose translating softly. He spoke about the sacred hoop of life, about how all things are connected, about the courage it takes to love after loss. He blessed their union with sweet grass and sage, calling on the spirits to guide and protect them. When it came time for vows, Joseph took both of Sarah's hands in his. His voice was steady but thick with emotion. "I thought I was finished with happiness," he said. "I thought the best I could hope for was to survive each day. Then you appeared, broken like me, and somehow in our brokenness we found strength. You've taught me that loving again isn't betraying who we loved before. It's honoring them by choosing life. I promise to carry Emma in my heart alongside Thomas and Maya. I promise to hold your grief as carefully as I hold my own. I promise to build a life with you that makes space for both sorrow and joy." Sarah's tears flowed freely as she spoke her own vows. "You found me in my darkest moment and showed me I wasn't alone. You gave me a place to grieve, a community to belong to, and a reason to believe in tomorrow. I promise to honor your losses as my own. I promise to learn your language and your traditions. I promise to love you with everything I have, knowing that love is always a risk but always worth it." They exchanged rings, simple bands of silver that Joseph had crafted himself, inscribed with Lakota words that meant two hearts, one spirit. When Henry declared them married, Joseph pulled Sarah close and kissed her deeply, and the community erupted in celebration. Drums began to beat, voices rose in traditional songs, and Sarah felt herself swept up in a joy she had thought was impossible. The feast that followed lasted into the night. Sarah sat beside Joseph, watching people dance and laugh and tell stories, feeling overwhelmed by gratitude. These people who had been strangers 6 months ago had become her family. They had given her a home not just in a place but in a way of being. They had taught her that healing didn't mean forgetting, that moving forward didn't require leaving the past behind. As the celebration wound down, Joseph led her to the truck he had decorated with wildflowers and traditional symbols. They were spending their wedding night in a cabin in the Black Hills, a place Joseph said was sacred and powerful. As they drove through the darkness, Sarah rested her head on his shoulder, feeling more at peace than she had in years. The cabin was simple and beautiful, perched on a hillside with a view of the stars that seemed close enough to touch. Inside, a fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and someone had left flowers and traditional foods as gifts. Joseph and Sarah stood together at the window, looking out at the vast night sky. "Do you ever regret it?" Joseph asked quietly. "Staying here? Leaving your old life behind?" Sarah considered the question. She had sold her apartment in Boston, quit her job, severed most ties to her former existence. Her family back east thought she had lost her mind, running off to marry someone she barely knew, joining a community so different from her own background. They didn't understand that she hadn't been running away, she had been running toward something essential. "I don't regret anything," she said firmly. "That life ended when Emma died. I couldn't go back to being who I was before, even if I wanted to. This place, these people, you helped me become someone new. Someone who can carry grief without being destroyed by it. Someone who understands that the heart is bigger than we think, that it can hold loss and love at the same time." Joseph turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "I see Emma in your eyes every day," he said. "I see how much you love her, how much you miss her. That will never change, and I would never want it to. She made you who you are. She's part of our story." Sarah felt the familiar ache in her chest, but it was different now. Softer somehow. Less like drowning and more like remembering. She knew she would grieve Emma for the rest of her life, that certain moments would always bring crushing waves of sadness. Mother's Day. Emma's birthday. Random moments when she saw a little girl with golden curls and the world tilted sideways with loss. But she also knew she would laugh again. Love again. Find meaning and purpose and connection. She could hold both truths simultaneously, that she had lost everything and that she had found everything. That her darkest moment had led her exactly where she needed to be. Joseph kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. They moved together toward the bed, shedding layers of clothing in grief, choosing intimacy over fear, connection over isolation. As they came together, Sarah felt wholly present in her body for the first time in months. This was real. This was now. This was choosing to live fully even though she knew how much it could hurt. Later, wrapped in Joseph's arms with the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls, Sarah thought about the strange journey that had brought her here. If someone had told her 6 months ago that car trouble on a reservation would lead to love and healing, she would have laughed bitterly. She had been so certain her story was over, that happiness was something that happened to other people. But life had other plans. The universe, or the spirits, or simple chance had put her exactly where she needed to be. And she had been brave enough to stay. Brave enough to open her shattered heart one more time. Brave enough to believe that even in the midst of grief, new love could grow. Sarah closed her eyes and sent a silent thought to Emma. Thank you for teaching me how to love fearlessly. I carry you with me always. Then she sent gratitude to the land that had held her, the people who had welcomed her, and the man whose arms made her feel safe enough to finally, truly rest. Her darkest moment had led her here, to a Lakota chief who understood loss as intimately as she did. Together, they were proof that broken things could mend, that endings could become beginnings, that love was always possible if you were willing to risk your heart one more time. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. The prairie breathed with the wind. And Sarah Mitchell Broken Arrow slept peacefully, finally home.